Right, okay. Well, good evening, everybody, to tonight's standard meeting. Rather different set of circumstances to deal with, but then again, these are unprecedented circumstances, but we'll do our best, and thankfully we'll manage to get some form of meeting going. Now, before I go on to the main agenda, I'd just like to ask Alex to ask everybody to sort of call the name out and say who they are, please.
Hi, good evening, Chair, Councillor Ajit Atwell.
Thanks, Councillor Khan. If I just briefly run through the list of attendees, it perhaps be a bit more straightforward. So I'll just go through the attendees on the call. We've got Councillor Atwell present from the Liberal Democrat group. We have Councillor Alan W. Graves from the Reform Derby group. We have Councillor Matthew Holmes, who I understand is substituting for Councillor Alison Holmes from the Conservative group. We have Councillor Sean Marshall as an independent representative, and of course yourself, Chair, as representative of the Labour group. Also on the call we have our 4 independent members. We have Mr Alan Cameron, Dr Stuart Green, Mr Peter Purnell and Mr Philip Sunderland. And in terms of officers on the call, we have Emily Feenan, who is the Director of Legal Procurement and Democratic Services and Monitoring Officer. We have myself, I'm the Acting Head of Democracy. We have Stephen Mason, who is supporting the meeting this evening from a Democratic Services perspective, and we also have a number of supporting officers from IT and Democratic Services working in the background. So that's everyone, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex, and just going on to the main agenda. Any apologies from anybody?
Chair, so we have apologies from Councillor Alison Holmes. Thank you.
Thank you. Late items to be introduced by the Chair. Well, I don't have any, thankfully, right, to introduce. So item number 3 is declarations of interest. Now, rather than, you know, everybody sort of, or whoever is eligible to declare, so can we just, or whichever one of you hasn't declared, can you declare them as and when is necessary rather than saying them now? Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's
yes?
fine, Chair. Yeah.
Okay. Item number 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 22nd of October last year. Anybody like to move them? Or anything to add?
Chair, could I just confirm, it's Emily Feenan, Chair. I just want to confirm that resolutions 1 and 2 as set out in the minutes of the meeting on the last meeting have been completed.
Okay. With that in mind, does anybody want to move them and or add something to them?
Move them, Chair.
Okay. Seconder?
Yeah, I'll second, Chair.
Thank you. Item 5, review of the local government ethical standards report. Now, at this point, I'm going to let Emily go through the agenda in the sort of interest of making it a bit quicker than, well, as quick as possible, really, because, as I said, we are on a different type of meeting here and not in the committee room. So, Emily, if you'd like to go through the agenda for me, please.
That's absolutely fine, Chair. Thank you very much. So if I could refer members to item 5 on the agenda, which, as Chair has mentioned, is the review of the Local Government Ethical Standards Report. For those of you who were members of last year's Standards Committee, you will recall that at our last meeting on the 22nd of October, we did discuss the Local Government Ethical Standards Report, which had been produced by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. We considered the list of recommendations and the list of best practice, and members resolved at that meeting to agree that myself would consider the list of recommendations and bring a report to this meeting of Standards Committee with any relevant recommendations. The list of recommendations and the list of best practice, along with my comments and recommendations, are attached to Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 to this report. So if I just take members to those 2 appendices, I don't propose going through them in detail. As you can see, in Appendix 1, this is a table which sets out who is responsible for implementing the recommendations that were made by the committee. And as you will see going through, that all of those, the responsibility vests in either the local government association or the government to implement those. If I then take you on to Appendix 2, which is the list of best practice that was recommended by the committee. We have gone through those, and in relation to each of those recommended best practices, I've made a comment and just explained how that is addressed by the council already in its current existing practices. I will, however, draw committee's attention to row 2 of Appendix 2, which stated that councils should include provisions in their code of conducts requiring councillors to comply with any formal standards investigation and prohibiting trivial or malicious allegations by councillors. We don't have this specific provision in our code of conduct at the current time, and I would like to ask the committee whether you think it would be appropriate for such a provision to be included.
Councillor Atwell, Councillor Graves, or Councillor Holmes, any one of you would like to add to that?
Councillor Holmes has indicated to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Just to sort of delve into that a little bit, how would we ascertain whether a complaint is trivial or malicious? Work through in my head how that would help.
I think we would build it into, if you recall, Councillor Holmes, the flow chart by which we deal with complaints that come in. We have a sort of sifting stage right at the start, where when the complaint comes in, I consult with the 4 independent persons to gain their view, and it's at that point where we already consider whether we think a complaint is politically driven, for example. And so I think if we were to adopt it, we would build it in at that point. And so there would be one of the questions I would ask the independent persons was whether they considered a complaint to be trivial or malicious. And if so, then that could be then sifted and essentially pulled out of the process at that stage.
Okay, I can understand, sorry Chair, if I may, I can understand trivial. I think that would be probably fairly straightforward to make a call on, and obviously it'd be the independents with your guidance to make that call. I'm just, I'd be interested, maybe it's something for offline, but I think at least group leaders or maybe the committee themselves need to just understand a little bit about some examples of what malicious allegations would be. I'm just trying to, see how that process would be assessed, really.
One suggestion that I could do for Councillor Holmes is, obviously these recommendations are still relatively new by the Committee on Standards and Public Life. I could take some soundings from other authorities to see how they've adopted, if they have adopted this recommendation. Obviously, later in the agenda, we have taken some advice on our current processes and procedures. So I could consult with some external experts on how this has been incorporated elsewhere, if at all.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, I think that would be very, very advisable and helpful, actually, that at least we can then see whether we're compatible or actually doing better than some of the other councils that have maybe adopted or not adopted this, rather than to be a sort of lone authority that does this and be quoted sometimes in a good stead, sometimes in a bad stead by other authorities. So yes, I think that would be beneficial for all concerned, and once you have that, then maybe, as Matthew said, you could go to the relevant party leaders and they can then share it with their members. I have a little note here. Philip Sunderland, would you like to speak, Philip?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I think trivial is fairly straightforward. I think I would have thought malicious. In my experience, malicious, if you see it, you'll know when it's malicious. That's just from experience of looking at these things, but quite clearly it can cover all sorts of things, and we can give all sorts of instances of why they may or may not be malicious. But I think, from my point of view, when I saw it, I'd know what it was. That's all I wanted to say on that one. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Anyone else?
Chair, I would be interested if members of committee, how they felt about the first part of best practice number 2, requiring councils should include provisions in their code of conduct requiring councillors to comply with any formal standards investigation. Whether members of committee would think that would be useful.
Anybody wishing to speak?
Could I just say a few words? I think it's quite clear that, yes, it should be included, and quite clearly it should be up for review on a regular basis. So number 3 talks about a regular review. I mean, whether it's annual or biannual, whatever, it should be reviewed on a regular basis as well. So yes, from my point of view, I think it ought to be included within the procedures.
Matthew, I take it you'd like to say something.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Again, could you offer an example of what non-compliance would be? Again, the context.
I think it would be, for example, if I'd appointed an investigator to investigate a standards complaint and the subject member refused to engage with that investigation, for example, which is very unhelpful because it makes it very difficult to conclude an investigation. I must stress that situation hasn't arisen during my tenure as monitoring officer, but it would if a subject member refused to comply with an investigation. It would be very difficult to bring it to close.
And just sorry, Chair, just another question on this one then. So if this was in the code of conduct, wouldn't it be an oxymoron that if a councillor refused to comply with the formal standards, that would be a standards complaint in itself? So that's
we could get into an endless circle. Yes, I agree.
Well done, Matthew, for pointing that out. Anyone else? Well, in that case, you can carry on, Emily.
Okay, so I'll work on the basis that in relation to number 2, I'll come back to the next meeting with some examples. I also wanted to draw councillors' attention to number 3, which is a requirement to have a regular review of the code of conduct. At the moment, we don't have a formal review period for our code of conduct. It was last reviewed in September 2019. So my initial question to committee was whether you wanted to agree a more formal time period for when we have it as essentially a standing item on our agenda of standards committee. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to draw members of committee's attention to the fact that the Local Government Association is currently undertaking a consultation on a new model code of conduct. That some of you may have already picked up on this if you're signed up for mailings from the LGA. That consultation is currently live and ends on Monday the 17th of August. I wanted to draw the committee's attention to it so that if you wish to respond to that consultation in your own right as members, you would be able to do so. Stephen can provide you with the links to it. But also just to let you know that as a Democratic Services group of officers, we will respond to that consultation, and so if anyone wanted to make any representations to us as a group of officers before we put in our consultation response, to encourage you to do so. What it does mean though is that there will be it's intended that there will be a new model code of conduct to be reviewed by the LGA's Executive Advisory Board and then the LGA General Assembly in the autumn of this year. So if that new code of conduct does move forward and is ratified by the LGA, it may be that you think it would be helpful as a committee that we then schedule that for our standards committee meeting at the start of 2021 for us to review that as a committee and consider whether we would want to adopt it or adopt any parts of it.
Well, my own view on that, yes, we should have annual reviews on it, but there shouldn't be anything to stop us from adding or subtracting to that as circumstances and experiences come about. There may be issues that we haven't come across before on the standards committee, and like you was mentioned earlier on about new advice, new code of conduct. So yes, we should have a review annually, but there shouldn't be anything to prevent us from adding or indeed subtracting something from that code. Anybody else would like to comment on that?
Agree with you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Okay, carry on, Emily. They seem to be agreeing with us.
I think Councillor Atwell's just indicated, Chair.
Sorry, I didn't.
I think you're right, Chair, in what you're saying. I think, yeah, there's no point, and it is what it is. And obviously, if something comes up, it needs to be reviewed, and we'll take it from there. So I think that's the best way forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So what we'll record the action from that is that I'll ask Stephen to circulate the details of the consultation to you all, so you're aware of it. And as and when the new model code comes forward, Stephen and I will make sure it goes on to the next committee, standards committee agenda at that point. Okay.
That's fine, Emily.
Thank you. The only other one I was just going to flag with you is row 13. And that is just to let members know that we are currently just consulting with an external law firm and whether we need to do anything about conflicts of interest. I suspect we probably, I think our procedures cover it, but I'm just double checking on that point, and we can let committee know if there's any subsequent changes required.
Okay, thank you for that.
So that was all I wanted to say on item 5 of the agenda, Chair. So I don't know if you want to move to the recommendations now on item 5.
Yes, I would move to that recommendation.
Mr. Chairman. Have we discussed the alterations? Because on the agenda, we were sent another document by Stephen to address, and I just
that's item 6, Councillor Graves.
Is it?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I know you're a bit eager, Al, to start having your tea, but we'll have to wait a bit. Right. So item 5 then, are we okay with that? Somebody like to move it?
Chair. Moved.
Seconded?
Yeah, I'll second that. No problem.
Okay then, Emily, that's fine. Moving on to item 6 now.
Thank you very much, Chair. Okay, so I'll just give a short introduction to this item 6, which is procedures for the assessment and review of allegations of breaches of the Councillor's Code of Conduct. In the last municipal year, I instructed Waitmans LLP to conduct an external review of the procedures for the assessment and review of allegations of breach of the Councillor's Code of Conduct. During the course of an investigation, a standards investigation, it had become apparent to us that there were some omissions from our current procedures. Those had been adopted a couple of years ago now, but unfortunately the procedures sort of stopped rather abruptly at the point in which an investigation happened, and didn't set out any procedures for taking that investigation forward, what happened in the run-up to a hearing, or how indeed we carried out a hearing following an investigation. So quite a fundamental gap. So I requested that Waitmans review our process and procedures, and they have recommended 2 additional appendices: Appendix E, the pre-hearing process, and Appendix F, hearings procedure, and they're set out as appendices to item 6, this item 6 report. In addition, in the course of doing that review, and also through mine and Stephen's experience of managing some complaints through our standards complaints procedure, we had become aware that there were some other areas within our standards processes which were not entirely clear, or slightly inconsistent, or just generally in need of a bit of tightening up. And so there is also at Appendix 3 of this report, you've been provided with the markup which Councillor Graves just referred to, which is where we've proposed some additional changes to the main body of the standards procedures, and those are attached for Councillors' attention. I wasn't intending to take you through these appendices in detail. Hopeful that members have had an opportunity to look at those in advance. I appreciate there may well be some typos within the documents. If members have picked up those, please feel free to forward them to Stephen. I don't suggest we go through them in detail during this meeting, but if you could forward them on to Stephen, he can collate those. And if members are minded to move forward with these additional appendices, they can be included in the final version which would go to full council for ratification. So it's probably easiest actually if Chair, for members to comment now if they have any specific questions or more general comments other than just typos on the proposed new processes.
Yes, I mean, this goes back to what I said earlier on about, yes, having annual reviews, but also being able to add, subtract when we need to, as you've just said about some of the things that we were not doing properly or had missed out, or some of the things that we could have done better. So, yes, that's why I think it's you know, incumbent upon us to make sure that the annual reviews can and should be, you know, sort of added to or subtracted to as and when we need to. So, anybody else would like to speak? Alan, you put your funny face up. I take it you'd like to speak on that first.
Yeah, that's me putting my hand up. Yes, I'd like to. I have already emailed Stephen about this. Somewhere around section 29 or 30, I think it should be made clear that interviewees in the investigation are asked to agree or confirm the investigator's comments in relation to their interview. This clarifies and legitimizes the investigator's report.
I think that's a valid point there, Al. They should be asked that. So, Emily, you can elaborate on that.
I think that's acceptable. Thank you, councillors. That would be standard procedure for the reports are forwarded to the subject member and the complainant in draft format. An investigator report would be for comment and review, and for the investigator to take on board those comments as an, if appropriate, to do so.
Matthew, you put yourself down for a marker, mate. Go on.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the investigations, discussions with those involved, whether it be the complainant or the person who's being complained about, would there be any justification in the committee's view to have those conversations recorded? It may be that there'd have to be a governance review of the justification for that, and data protection and GDPR, etc. The reason I raise it is because it would offer potential absolute clarity on what was said, and so there'd be no misinterpretation of any conversations. It would be helpful, I think, for everybody if that was something which we could do, or would it be appropriate, Emily?
I see no reason why it wouldn't be possible for us to do that, Councillor Holmes. I don't know if that's something which is sort of standard practice across other standards processes. So I'd like to make a few investigations about that before I committed to it now. But yes, I don't see any reason in principle why that wouldn't be possible. I think we just have to agree how any such recordings could be brought into any hearing, given that the investigator produces a final report which goes to the hearing, and that's the final version of that report. It's a final report. So I'd need to just work out how and if and when you could bring any such recording into the hearing process.
Or to aid with transcription, maybe.
I take that point, yes.
I think, yes, by all means, we should have a look at other authorities. The only sort of, point that I can see on that is about the recording and storage of it, and, the sort of data protection and legality of how we're doing. So, Emily can find that out, and if it's possible, then I don't see why not.
I think, Chair, if it would probably be, if it was possible to add anything, it would probably be at paragraph 31. The investigation will be carried out thoroughly, but also proportionally taking into account the requirements of natural justice, the complexity and seriousness of the complaints and resources of the council. If appropriate, it would probably be something along the lines of, if appropriate, in the investigators or monitoring officer's opinion, interviews may be recorded and stored for future evidence purposes in accordance with data protection legislation. Something along those lines?
Yes, I think that's, probably the best we're going to get under the circumstances.
Would that be acceptable to other councillors?
Councillor Holmes?
Absolutely, yes, Chair.
Just as well. Philip Sunderland, you've indicated to speak.
Yeah, just a quick one, really. On the thing about the draft hearings, the hearings will normally take place in public. Press and public may be excluded from the hearing if grounds in, it says section 12A, it's actually scheduled 12 of 12A, but anyway, I was querying whether they should be in public, because some of the comments that might be made might be more appropriate made in non-public sections of the hearings. We did have a hearing many years ago, and I'm not sure anybody is still involved with it, and that was actually in private. There was no consideration at that time about whether it should have been in public. Perhaps there should have been. I just query whether having it in public is the appropriate mechanism. That's all. Thank you.
Emily?
I think the presumption should be that a hearing is held in public, Philip, on the basis of transparency and also the reality is that the standards process does not have a great deal of strength to it, but I think the fact that a hearing will be carried out in public does give some further sort of resilience and strength to a standards process. And obviously, if there were grounds for holding it with the press and public excluded, then those could be considered and, if necessary, applied. But I think the presumption should be a public hearing with consideration of exclusion of the press and public.
Yeah, I'm quite happy for that as a presumption in the first instance. But if, for instance, the sanctions become a lot stronger, like you can ban a councillor for 6 months, for instance, it raises the stakes considerably, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. That was really my concern. I mean, whether there's a problem there. So that was why I raised it. But I accept that, the presumption is in public unless otherwise. But I would suspect that in many cases it would not be in public. But that's would have to be horses for courses in a sense, isn't it?
I think it would be taking each one on a case by case basis.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, nothing further? Are we done on that then, Emily?
Okay, so if I could just take members back to the two recommendations at paragraph 2.2 of the report. That does the committee recommend to council that the procedures be amended as discussed?
Yes, I'd be happy with that, Chair.
Yeah, I'm okay with that, Chair.
Yeah, I don't have any issues with that. As I said, provided we can add or subtract to it as and when we have new experiences. But by and large, I think, yes, we can put that forward for recommendation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chair. So Stephen and I will prepare the report to go to full council on the 22nd of July.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
So if everyone's ready, we can move on to item 7. That's a very quick report. Item 7 is a summary of progress with councillor complaints in 2019-20 and 2020-21. More information is provided in the exempt part of the meeting, which item 9 of the agenda. But just for the purpose of this point in the agenda, one complaint was carried over from 2018-19 municipal year to 2019-20. This complaint was dismissed. 9 complaints were received in 2019-20. 4 complaints were dismissed. 1 complaint was resolved through an informal resolution, and 4 complaints are still live and have been carried over to the 2021 municipal year. Again, a summary is set out in the confidential section. And 1 complaint has already been received in the 2021 municipal year, and again a summary is provided later on. And the recommendation is that committee note the information contained in the report.
Thank you for that, Emily. Anybody wish to add anything? Agreed. Thank you, Alan and Matthew. Right, we can move on then to the next item, and this is where we have to exclude the press and public members. And to consider a resolution to exclude the press and public during consideration of the following items under Section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972. The press and public be excluded from the meeting during discussion of the following items as defined on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1 and 2 of Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act, and that the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. I hope that was clear enough for everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Can I suggest we just hand over to Stephen at this point, just to go through some practical steps that we need to take at this point.
Okay, all yours, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. So we're just waiting now for confirmation that the YouTube broadcast has ended, and I think it's Paul Parkin that we have helping us this evening with that.
Stephen, Paul's just raised a quick query